and welcome to the Drexel interview. I'm your host, Paula Morantz-Cohen, and today our guest is Dana Gioia, Chairman of the National Endowment for the Arts. Dana Gioia is also a noted poet, translator, librettist, anthologist, and cultural critic. This is part one of a two-part interview. In this segment, we'll focus on our guest's vision for the NEA and some of the programs which he's developed during his tenure. In the second part of our interview, we'll talk more about his own poetry and his critical and cultural writing. Dana Gioia, welcome to the Drexel interview.
Good to be here in this beautiful room.
Yes, we like this room. I want to talk a little bit about your coming to the NEA. You were appointed in 2003, and this was following a decade of some strife and some controversy. There had been questions about some of the artists that had been funded by the NEA at that time during the late 80s and 90s. Robert Mapplethorpe, Andre Serrano, Karen Finley, and others. And their work was criticized as obscene or inappropriate by some people. And there were even efforts or there was talk of cutting funding radically and perhaps even eliminating the NEA altogether. Tell us a little bit about what was involved in stepping into that position at that moment and how you weathered that controversy, so to speak.
Well, you know, the NEA is 40 years old this fall.
Okay.
And it's a program that was begun in the end of the Great Society program. Lyndon Baines Johnson signed the initial legislation on September 29th, 1965. And so over this 40 years, what you've seen is how in a democracy do you create a public arts agency? You know, it's something that there really is almost no precedent for in American history except for the WPA program. And during that time, there was a period of about 10 years where there were a lot of controversies. I'm happy to say that those things are now behind us. And one of the problems was that the NEA has given 120,000 grants in its 40-year history, but most people only know about a dozen of them, and those are the dozens that became controversial. So when I stepped into the job, one of the things that I thought was important was that the National Endowment for the Arts, as a public agency, had to do a better job of communicating what its public value was. And so I took very seriously the responsibility, in a sense, of creating the right image for this agency so that it could do its work in a democracy.
Okay, well that makes a lot of sense to me on the one hand. On the other hand, and I know you've written that you feel that the organization should answer to the people, which I guess is part of this democratic thrust. And yet art so often is different, iconoclastic, goes against the status quo. Is there any sense in which you feel there's a tension there between the agency and the fact of being democratic, as you say? Well,
you know, my vision for the NEA is really quite simple. You know, it is to take the best of art, realizing that, you know, that the best in art are very diverse, broad concepts, and to bring it to the broadest possible public, in a sense to democratize the agency, you know, without, in a sense, lowering its artistic values. Now, the thing about art that I think it's important to remember is that art is not controversial, it's not safe, it's not bold, it's not conservative. Art is a human language. There are a series of human languages, like in this room. Painting is a language of image, of line, of color. Dance is of movement, music is of sound. And like any language, everything in human experience can be articulated in these languages. And so I think what we need to do is to celebrate the full range of those languages by bringing works of excellence to a broad public. The trouble is, if people don't know what you're doing, and they don't know the 120,000 grants that you've given, and they hear one grant they don't like, they typify everything else that you're doing. So it seemed to me that there was a failure of imagination, a failure of communication in the Arts Endowment historically, because it more or less took its role for granted. They figured that people would understand what it's doing. And I think that a public agency must always justify itself in a democracy. And so one of the things we did was to try to have signature programs of indisputable merit and unprecedented public reach. and to make those things that the average American, be they the average American on the street or in Congress or in the press or in a classroom, understood because they saw them in their communities.
Okay, I take it then, for example, these initiatives that have to do with Shakespeare.
Well, one of them is Shakespeare.
Shakespeare for a new generation, Shakespeare in American communities. Are these two different initiatives?
Well, they're actually two sides of the same program.
Okay.
I mean, I'll give you an example. I tend to think of the art world a little differently, I believe, than some of my predecessors did, in the sense that I see the art world as an ecology. You've got all of these segments of culture that are interdependent. And I'll give you an example with Shakespeare. You have theater companies that would like to tour, but touring is now uneconomical. You have thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of actors in the United States who don't have enough work. You have a whole generation of American kids who have never seen a play. You've got American teachers who teach drama to classes that have never seen a play. And all 50 states mandate that their students study Shakespeare in high school. Mm-hmm. You've also got people that are presenters that run theaters, cultural centers, that can't afford to book serious drama. So what we did was create a program, in a sense, which dealt with the whole ecology of theater and education with a single program.
And linked it to Shakespeare.
Yes, we have, right now we have 47 theater companies that include some of the finest companies in the United States. I mean, the Guthrie, the Acting Company, Chicago Shakespeare Festival, and they are touring 250 cities and also 18 military bases with new productions of Shakespeare. Now, in the evenings, they perform these in the communities, and most of these towns are small and mid-sized communities that have no professional theater, and they perform those plays. But during the day, we bring in whole classes of high school students and their teachers and chaperones for free performances of Shakespeare. In the last 2 years, we have brought 1 million American high school students into a free production of Shakespeare. For 70% of these kids, it's the first time they've been in the theater. Mm-hmm. We've also given 1,000 actors work. We've booked Shakespeare in towns that have never had Shakespeare in their whole history. So with one program, we're meeting the needs of actors, of theater companies, of presenters, of teachers, of students and theater audiences.
So I think I understand what you're saying about the democratization of the way in which you want to spend money for the NEA. At the same time, it sounds like you're also saying that there are so many ways that you can use the organization that would not be particularly controversial in the ways that had been before.
Not the least. See, I think you're obsessed with controversy. I mean,
I'm not obsessed with it.
What is controversy? I mean, controversy is an argument about something.
Yeah.
We do 2,000 grants a year. I think if you saw the full range of our grants, you'd be impossible to typify it. The problem with the controversy is if you have a controversy out of context, that's all people know.
Well, how does controversy happen out of context then? What happened?
If you know nothing about it, if you know nothing about an agency, and that's all you know, then the controversy becomes typical rather than.
So you think this is a public relations or marketing element?
No. I think what we're trying to do is to bring the best of art to the broadest people, and to make sure that we communicate our value. I mean, we did. The interesting thing about the Shakespeare program is that we've been able to do it entirely with incremental funds. We've been able to grow the agency's budget to do it. We still do 135 world premieres each year. We have 2,000 grants a year, mm-hmm. And so, and this is simply one little section of them. But I think what we are doing is taking a very definite public need. The fact that we have, here's what one of the things that the way I think about it is that in the years since the Mapplethorpe controversy, there's been 60 million kids born in the United States. We have people going back and forth on a controversy from the previous century, and there's no one in the United States, nobody in the media, nobody in Congress, that's really seriously addressing of what role do we want arts and arts education to play in this new generation for these kids in their education and in the community surrounding them.
Okay.
That is an enormous need in this country.
Right. But then I do think, and I will go back now to address some of your background, which is in business and particularly in marketing, that there is something of that going on in the sense that you're seeing these needs and you're figuring out ways to address them in a way that will enhance the profile of the agency.
Well, it's also, I mean, I believe the best way to run a public agency is to do the best work possible and to communicate what you're doing clearly. I mean, one thing I learned in marketing is that you try to make the best products possible. You try to communicate why they're good and to communicate it clearly. I mean, I think one of the problems with the NEA, if you think about this, is that it was created 40 years ago to enrich and enhance American life by bringing art, especially to people who didn't have it easily accessible in their lives. The way we've done this is largely through discrete grants. So we give 2,000 grants, and you can solve certain needs that way. But some of the needs that our society has for art are huge. They're national, and we have a unique opportunity in Washington to, in a sense, think on a national scale. To think not for just this town, but think in terms of millions of kids. For example, we have a jazz program that's coming out later this year that we're working with Wynton Marsalis and Jazz at Lincoln Center. This will be used by probably as many as 8 million kids in classrooms. I mean, we can talk about it more later, but that's the kind of scale that only the NEA can think of. And I think one of the problems we've had in the past is a failure of imagination, a failure to say, what are the really broad needs that we have, especially in education or in communities, and to address them on a scale that you can only do at a federal level.
Okay, so there has been, in a sense, a shift away from perhaps individual grants to larger regional or
well, we still give individual grants. We give individual grants and for fiction, poetry, folk arts, for jazz, for translation, for nonfiction writing, for traditional arts. But what I think we're doing is think of individual grants in terms of individual organization grants, and take 40 or 50 individual organization grants and put them together under an umbrella. I mean, for example, if you fund a jazz concert in the city, you may sell out 50% of the tickets. But if you put together a whole tour and you create national publicity in it, suddenly you're selling out every concert. It's good for the presenters, it's good for the artists, it's good for the public. And it also allows you to sort of reach through the media. So what we're trying to do, and I think, is to think on a more ambitious scale. I mean, one of the cultural changes I like to think that I've done at the Arts Endowment is that we're not apologetic about our mission. We are committed to the basic vision of the NEA, which is to make art, the best of art, accessible to all Americans. And there were periods in our history where we didn't reach a significant portion of the public. I mean, 2 years ago was the first time that we really reached every community in the United States. And I'm very proud of actually giving grants to areas of the U.S. that had never done it before. Another area is the military. There's nearly 4 million Americans that are in the military families. A lot of them are at these rural bases. You've got these kids that are being raised on these bases, and they have very little access to the kind of art that would be in a community.
Well, would you address again, it has been controversial, and I know our listeners would be interested in hearing your take on this Operation Homecoming, which was an initiative to have American military personnel returning from Iraq and Afghanistan take part in essentially writing workshops where they expressed their experiences in poetry and prose. And I do think it sparked some criticism. Could you explain a little bit about what was behind it and also what you would say to your critics?
Well, actually, we've had almost no critics, to be honest. We've only had, one small controversy on it. There was a debate in Poetry magazine.
In fact, you were very, I think, much dynamically involved in that.
No, actually, I stayed entirely out of it.
Oh, I thought you wrote a letter or two.
No, I didn't.
Okay, I'm sorry.
No, we've had hundreds of articles about Operation Homecoming, all of which I think have been enthusiastic about it. It's a very simple idea. And it really came out of the fact that there's a woman named Marilyn Nelson. She's the poet laureate of Connecticut. Her father was one of the Tuskegee Airmen. And she's an African-American poet. And she and I were talking about how when people are in really stressful times of their life, they need art the most, yet it's the time when it's hardest to get. And she had just been a visiting professor at West Point. And she was pointing out that some of the students that she had, these young men and women that she had, were being deployed in Afghanistan. And we thought it would be a wonderful idea for people that were really coming out of these very stressful, challenging times in their life to have the kind of clarity that literature brought. So we asked what ultimately became about 40 major American writers. They're in every genre, from novelists, poets, historians, journalists. They cross the entire political spectrum. But they're eminent people like Bobby Ann Mason, Tobias Wolff. We have popular writers like Tom Clancy. We have poets like Marilyn Nelson. We have sort of journalist historians like Mark Bowden, who wrote Black Hawk Down. And they volunteered to teach writing workshops for the troops that were coming out of rotation and their spouses, because we actually have a lot of male and female spouses that are that are part of the home front, so they could write about their wartime experience. And we really thought they did three things. First of all, it gave these people some clarity during these challenging periods of their lives. Secondly, it provides a record of the war that's not the war as politicians describe it, not the war as journalists describe it, but the war as individuals lived it. And finally, it probably is going to produce one of the largest written records of these wars, because most of it's happening on cell phones or in emails and things like that.
So is there an anthology that's going to
Yeah, and we're doing an anthology. And so we've had, we've had hundreds of articles written about this program. And a lot of people came in and said, oh, let's go find out how it's politicized. And New York Times has done 3 pieces. All 3 pieces said, what a great program this is. Because it isn't politicized. It's about bringing art to people who wouldn't get it otherwise. And we have an anthology that will come out with the best of this work. We've gotten 11,000 pages of submission.
And some of this submission is critical of the experience of wartime? All types?
It's all over.
Okay.
I mean, it's,
I'm glad you clarified that.
See, we're not, we're giving the individual soldier, sailor, Marine, pilot, spouse a chance to talk about their own experience. We're not predetermining what that experience is.
Okay. Tell me about another initiative that intrigues me called the Big Read.
Well,
is that underway yet?
Yeah,
or is that
we're
still
just
in the
about to announce it.
stage?
Actually,
Yeah.
what it comes out of is that we did a study of American reading that was a lugubrious affair. I mean, this is the saddest study that any person who really loves literature could possibly read, because what we demonstrated from the study, which has a 17,000 sample size, so it's statistically 20 times the size of your normal statistical study, perfectly matched to the US population, is that every group of Americans is reading less than they did 10 years ago and 20 years ago. Every age group, income group, educational group, racial group, region, and both genders. And in fact, younger Americans have in 20 years gone from the people who read most in our society to the people who read least. And so it's very alarming. And so we began to look at this and say, what can you do? Because there's interesting things that happen. We were able to correlate this study with these people's other behaviors across the arts and civic activity. And what we see is that people who read are 3 times more likely to do volunteer work, charity work, go to the theater. They're 4 times more likely to go to a museum. They're even twice as likely to go to a ball game, which means that you see the country bifurcating into one group which reads and is very involved in their community. They tend to be more active. Now, they do everything the other group does. They watch TV, they play video games, they have iPods, they go onto the internet, but they balance their time better. And there's another group that increasingly just stays home. So we try to create a program which would, in a sense, create a civic context and civic reinforcement for reading, and we're going to call it the Big Read.
Okay, so it's not as though you're going to be supporting certain books
to
be
read.
read.
We are.
Have they been chosen yet?
What we're doing is, it comes out of a grassroots program we see, which is called the City Reads, or the One Book programs, where a community chooses a book,
right,
and then they read it. So
Yeah.
we're taking this, which is a very nice but somewhat small grassroots idea, and we're going to bump it up to a level that no single community can afford. This goes back to my notion of being able to do things on a broader scale nationally.
Is the idea that the whole country will read one book?
No.
Okay.
We're having communities choose a book that they want to read. And we'll develop TV programming, radio programming, reader's guides, school materials, library materials, book club materials. We'll create partnerships with the public radio station, public TV station, the newspaper, the mayor's office, the library, community service groups. So we really have tremendous reach within a community. and create a kind of exciting, accessible material that really spurs people's interest.
Okay.
Because we think one of the things that's vanished in our society is that sort of social reinforcement of reading. Because let's say you read a really good book, but
Who
nobody
else
you
has
know
read
is
it?
reading
Yeah.
it. There's nobody to talk to.
Right,
So we're in a sense
right.
trying to create socialization around the reading of good books.
Okay, sounds good. I wonder if you talk a little bit about, you've traveled a great deal for the NEA, and I assume you
I've
traveled
traveled
before that.
every week for the last 3
Well,
years.
I assume you travel both within the United States, but also abroad, and I'm very interested in what you see when you travel abroad in terms of arts support. I mean, especially in Europe, from what I know, the support of the arts is very different from it is
Yeah.
in this country. Everything is very centralized. There's a notion of what art is, and it is supported generously by the governments of many countries. And I wonder if you talk a little bit about those differences and what you think it has meant for the cultural climate of those countries as opposed to the U.S.
Well, the American system of art support is radically different from everywhere in the world. And the interesting thing is that American artistic culture is vibrant, is diverse, and is dynamic. In Europe, the support of arts comes out of an aristocratic heritage. The kings, the dukes, the popes essentially supported art as an extension of the state. And it stays that way now. And so you tend to have a centralized ministry of culture that supplies a substantial budget for certain numbers of organizations, which sort of means that you're either supported by the government or you really can't exist. And so it's very lavish if you're on the inside and very crippling if you're on the outside.
And yet the cab drivers do read in Paris.
I don't know.
I mean, you get the sense of a culture that's more permeated with a sense of art and culture.
I do think what you see in Europe is something that's interesting. I think the European countries do a superb job of maintaining their national heritage. And so you have a country like Italy, which does an enormously expert job in terms of restoring buildings, paintings, and also taking a sense of what your national patrimony is and working it into the public education so people know their own history, know their own art. Their support of contemporary art is more problematic because I think you tend to have the insiders and the outsiders. The American system actually, the American government supports art more than any other country in the world by a huge margin, but we do it in a curious way called the tax deduction, which allows you and me and anybody else to give support art of our own choice wherever we want. So we can support, an anti-establishmentarian artist in Tulsa, or a traditional artist in Phoenix, or whatever our own taste is, and the government pays part of that bill. And so the American sort of organized support of the art, I mean, the National Endowment for the Arts is the largest annual funder of arts in the United States. I mean, we're really in a class by ourselves, and we're actually just under 1% of the total arts budget in the United States. And so that shows you that you don't really have the federal government dominating arts. And I think, although that makes the life for American artists a little more difficult, because of the tax deduction and because of public foundations and things like that, which simply don't exist in Europe to the same extent, that they do have more freedom and more diversity. And so I think that the American system allows art to be more localized, more diverse, and more free from government interference. Although American artists do have to scramble more than their European counterparts.
Yeah, they have to be more savvy.
But I think
and more
that the proof is in the pudding, and I would put the artistic achievement of the United States over the last 100 years against any nation in history. We've done things as diverse as modern dance and the graphic novel, abstract expressionism in the movies, wonderful, wonderful things that you wouldn't think being developed at the same time, but we've really excelled in almost every major art form.
I wouldn't disagree. We don't have too much time left, but I wondered if you would sketch for us a little bit of some of your plans, some of the initiatives that you would like to implement in the time that remains for you.
Well, the big read
chair.
is the thing that we're going to start it off, with about 10 cities, but I want to go more broadly than any reading program in the history of this country has. And I think that we have a moment right now where we still have over half the country sort of actively engaged, sort of adult, active, engaged literacy. They're reading literary books. They're reading books, and I think that we've got to sort of build on that continuity before it disappears, because we have a generation coming up for which reading is simply not as important. And so I think that that's something that's very, very timely. I also think it's very important to have more international exchanges in the arts. Over the last 20 years, the United States has really pulled back from a lot of international exchanges, bringing artists here, bringing our artists abroad, and I think that's a huge missed opportunity. I think it's good for American arts, and I think it's good for the United States to have all of these myriad conversations that
And why
really
do you
exist.
think that is, that there's been this rift, so to speak?
Well, part of it was something as literal as the U.S. Information Agency, which was part of the State Department, which brought artists and intellectuals abroad, that was dismantled during the Clinton administration because they felt the free market would do it all. But the free market won't do it all. There are kinds of conversations that I think really do need public support. So on the other hand, America's arts world is so vibrant, we tend to become parochial. We tend to look too internally and close it off. Also, Americans are notoriously monolingual. At least intellectual Americans. I mean, working class Americans like me were raised bilingually, so we know it. But if you go into there, so you don't have the internationalism, I think, that exists in a lot of European or Asian countries. But
So in a way, it will have to be one way. The reciprocity will have to be in English, it seems.
Well, this could be an opportunity for Americans to have the greatest language labs in the world. They're called Berlin, Paris, Rome, Prague.
Well, that might be another thing that the NEA could spearhead.
So I think the international thing is important. But I think also we have to, if you ask me the most important thing I can do as chairman of the National Endowment for the Arts, I think it's to try to revitalize and add excitement to American arts education. We have a whole generation of Americans who are being raised and being educated in schools where most of the formal arts education has been dropped. If the American economy is going to compete in a world economy in the 21st century, it's not going to be through cheap labor or cheap raw materials. It's going to be through imagination, innovation, and creativity. And how can we expect that from a generation that we're not training them in the arts? I think
and
it's
yet
impossible.
That's been a tradition in this country. The arts programs get cut first, the athletic programs get cut last. And it would be wonderful if that could be changed.
Yeah, no, I think that we should look, this doesn't sound too radical to me, but I guess for some people it is. I think the arts education program should be as essential to kids' education as sports.
Right.
I think sports are very important because some kids find themselves and develop parts of their personality and their character in sports, but they also do it in theater, they do it in the school paper, school magazine, in dance, in visual arts, in band, in chorus, and we have to keep those options open. There should be many paths to success and to self-realization for kids.
I would agree with you there. And I hope that for the rest of your tenure, you're going to be working to implement that.
I'll do my best.
Well, thanks so much for joining us today at the Drexel interview. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Okay, and thank you for joining us today for the Drexel interview.